Everyone's so upset about that teacher. He shouldn't have been in the road. But 70 years? Please, no! I'm only 16! You can't do this!
16-year-old Emma Johnson was sentenced to 70 years for the DUI, hit and run, that claimed the life of a beloved teacher. What the teen never anticipated was the moment her own parents would break their silence and testify against her, describing how their daughter had manipulated them into concealing the traffic camera footage that captured her face behind the wheel at the exact time and location of the fatal crash. This single piece of digital evidence, initially buried by a family caught in a web of lies, would ultimately expose the true nature of a teenager who valued her freedom more than the life she had so carelessly destroyed. Gabrielle Torres was killed instantly when a red sedan struck her at a crosswalk on East McDowell Road in Phoenix, Arizona on September 19, 2016. The 32-year-old elementary school teacher had been walking home after staying late to prepare materials for her third-grade class the next day, a routine evening shattered in seconds by a driver who never stopped to render aid. The vehicle's impact launched her body nearly 20 feet, leaving a trail of personal belongings scattered across the sun-baked asphalt. Lesson plans for the following day, a handwritten card from one of her students, and a small bag containing a birthday gift for her daughter. Behind the wheel of that red sedan was 16-year-old Emma Johnson, who had left a house party in the affluent neighborhood of Arcadia with a blood alcohol level later estimated to have been more than twice the legal limit. We appreciate you tuning into this episode of True Crime Analysis. If you're finding this case as disturbing as we are, please hit subscribe to follow our in-depth coverage of similar cases, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The story of Emma Johnson and the family conspiracy that followed her fatal decision would shock the Phoenix community to its core. The collision occurred at approximately 9:47 in the evening, captured partially by a gas station security camera that showed the moment of impact but couldn't clearly identify the vehicle's license plate or driver. Witnesses at the scene described hearing the sickening thud of the collision followed by the squeal of tires as the driver accelerated away rather than stopping. The red sedan had been traveling at approximately 52 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone when it struck Gabrielle, according to accident reconstruction specialists who would later testify at trial. Emma never applied the brakes before or immediately after the impact, suggesting she was either too impaired to recognize what had happened or made a split-second decision to flee the scene. What happened in the hours after the collision would eventually become central to the prosecution's case against not just Emma, but initially her parents as well. After striking Gabrielle, Emma drove directly to her family's home in the North Phoenix suburb of Paradise Valley, where security camera footage showed her arriving at 10:23 that evening, noticeably upset and examining damage to the front of the vehicle. Her parents, Margaret and Robert Johnson, were home when she arrived, and according to their later testimony, Emma burst into the house in tears, claiming she had hit a deer on the road. The teenager's behavior that night struck a neighbor as odd enough to later comment to police. Emma was seen laughing while on her phone less than an hour after arriving home, seemingly having recovered from her earlier distress with remarkable speed. The Johnson family's immediate response would later be characterized by prosecutors as a calculated conspiracy of silence. Within hours of Emma's return home, her father drove the damaged vehicle into their 3-car garage and closed the door, where it would remain hidden for the next 48 hours. Phone records would show that Robert Johnson made 4 calls to auto body repair shops the following morning, eventually arranging for a private repair at a cash-only facility on the outskirts of Scottsdale. Emma did not go to school the next day, with her mother calling her in sick, despite Emma posting on social media about shopping at a local mall that afternoon. The family maintained an outward appearance of normalcy while internally orchestrating what prosecutors would later call an elaborate cover-up designed to protect their daughter from the consequences of her deadly actions. What the Johnson family didn't know was that a red light camera at the intersection of East McDowell Road and North 44th Street had captured clear images of both their vehicle's license plate and, more damning still, Emma's face visible through the windshield at 9:45 that evening, just 2 minutes before the fatal collision. This critical piece of evidence went unnoticed in the initial investigation as detectives focused on gathering witness statements and canvassing local businesses for security footage. Emma's digital footprint would also prove crucial to the investigation. Her social media accounts contained multiple photos and videos from the party she had attended that evening, including several that clearly showed her consuming alcoholic beverages. In one particularly incriminating 10-second video, Emma could be seen holding a bottle of vodka and slurring, "Designated driver tonight, wish me luck," followed by laughter from her friends. The Phoenix Police Department initially treated the case as a standard hit-and-run, assigning Detective Nathaniel Reed to lead the investigation with a small team. The first 48 hours yielded little progress beyond establishing a general description of the vehicle and confirming that the victim had died instantly from catastrophic injuries. Detective Reed would later describe the case as frustrating during those early days, with fragments of evidence but no clear path to identifying the driver responsible. Gabrielle's family made emotional pleas on local news stations, begging for anyone with information to come forward as her 2 children, ages 8 and 10, struggled to comprehend their mother's sudden absence. The investigation seemed destined to become one of many unsolved hit-and-run cases in the metropolitan Phoenix area, where the sprawling highway system and desert roads often complicated efforts to locate fleeing drivers. The turning point came on September 22nd, when a traffic enforcement officer reviewing red light camera footage as part of routine citation processing noticed a red sedan matching the description from the hit-and-run. The officer, Marina Delgado, had seen the department bulletin about the fatal collision and made the connection between the vehicle description and the timestamp of the camera footage, which placed the Johnson family car in the vicinity just minutes before the fatal impact. What Delgado saw in that footage would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Not only was the license plate clearly visible, but so was Emma Johnson's face, illuminated by the interior lights of the vehicle and distinctly showing signs of impairment. The teenager appeared to be laughing while looking down at her phone, her attention clearly not on the road ahead, as she approached the intersection where Gabrielle Torres would lose her life moments later. When Detective Reed received Officer Delgado's report and reviewed the footage himself, he immediately recognized its significance. This wasn't just a lead, he would later testify, it was the smoking gun. The license plate was registered to Robert and Margaret Johnson, leading investigators directly to their Paradise Valley home less than 24 hours later. By this time, the red sedan had already been taken for repairs, but not before Robert Johnson had meticulously cleaned the vehicle's exterior using specialized products purchased from an automotive supply store, as security footage from the store would later confirm. What the Johnson family couldn't eliminate, however, was microscopic evidence. Despite their efforts, forensic examination would later reveal traces of Gabrielle Torres's DNA on the undercarriage of the vehicle, providing irrefutable proof of its involvement in the fatal collision. The extreme heat of the Phoenix summer had accelerated the decomposition of evidence at the crash site, making the traffic camera footage even more crucial to building a case. Phoenix, in September, still experiences temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, and the asphalt at the scene had reached temperatures hot enough to compromise some of the physical evidence left behind. Despite these challenges, Crime scene technicians had managed to recover fragments of the vehicle's headlight assembly and traces of automotive paint that would later be matched to the Johnson family's sedan. The technical investigation was painstaking, but each element contributed to what was becoming an increasingly solid case against Emma Johnson, whose digital footprint continued to provide damning evidence of both her intoxication that evening and her subsequent lack of remorse. Gabrielle Torres had been a fixture at Sunnyside Elementary School for 8 years, a dedicated third-grade teacher known for arriving early and staying late to ensure her students had every possible advantage. The 32-year-old single mother had grown up in South Phoenix herself, the daughter of Mexican immigrants who had instilled in her a profound belief in the transformative power of education. Her classroom walls were covered with inspirational quotes, student artwork, and photographs of field trips she had often funded partially from her own modest salary when school budgets fell short. Former students described her as the teacher who never gave up on anyone, recalling how she would provide extra tutoring during lunch breaks for struggling students and celebrate even the smallest achievements with genuine enthusiasm that made every child feel valued and capable. The morning after her death, the principal of Sunnyside Elementary, Diane Martinez, had the heartbreaking task of informing Gabrielle's students and colleagues. "I've never experienced anything more difficult than walking into that colorful classroom, filled with her presence, and telling 28 eight-year-olds that their teacher wouldn't be coming back," Martinez later recalled during a community memorial service. The children had made a wall of handwritten notes and drawings in the weeks that followed, many expressing confusion about why someone would hurt their teacher and drive away without helping her. One particularly poignant note from a student named Miguel read simply, "Ms. Torres taught me to read this year. Who will teach me the hard words now?" Gabrielle's commitment to education extended beyond her classroom duties into community outreach programs aimed at increasing parent involvement in the predominantly Hispanic and low-income neighborhood surrounding Sunnyside Elementary. She had established a weekly family reading night, securing donations of books in both English and Spanish so that parents could read with their children regardless of language barriers. Her colleagues described her as relentlessly positive, despite the challenges of teaching in an underfunded school district, often joking that optimism is my superpower when faced with budget cuts or bureaucratic obstacles. The superintendent of Phoenix School District later noted that Gabrielle had been selected for a teacher leadership position scheduled to begin the following semester, a promotion she never lived to accept. As a mother, Gabrielle had raised her 2 children, Elena and Marco, with the same dedication and creativity she brought to her classroom. Their modest apartment in Central Phoenix was filled with educational games, craft supplies, and books that reflected her belief that learning should be joyful and integrated into everyday life. Her sister, Carmen Torres, who would take custody of the children after Gabrielle's death, spoke at the funeral about how her sister would create elaborate scavenger hunts with educational clues to help her children learn new concepts while having fun. Friends recalled that despite the financial struggles of raising 2 children on a teacher's salary, Gabrielle never complained and instead found ingenious ways to provide enriching experiences for her family, such as free museum days and community cultural events. The night Gabrielle was killed, she had stayed late at school preparing special materials for a student with learning disabilities who was struggling with multiplication. In her tote bag, police found laminated cards with colorful visual aids designed to make abstract mathematical concepts more concrete and accessible. This final act of dedication to her students became symbolic of how she had lived her life, always going above and beyond to help others succeed. Her principal would later establish a teacher award in her name. given annually to educators who demonstrate exceptional commitment to supporting students facing challenges, ensuring that Gabrielle's approach to education would continue to influence the school community she had served so devotedly. Gabrielle's parents, Javier and Lucia Torres, had immigrated to Phoenix from Sonora, Mexico in the early 1980s, working multiple jobs to provide opportunities for their children. At her funeral, her father spoke through tears about how proud they had been when Gabrielle became the first in their family to graduate from college, earning her teaching degree from Arizona State University while working part-time and caring for her infant daughter. "She was our American dream come true," he said, his voice breaking as he described how his daughter had embodied their hopes for a better life through education and service to others. The Torres family's grief was compounded by the senseless nature of Gabrielle's death and the initial lack of accountability as the investigation continued without an immediate arrest. The impact of Gabrielle's absence extended far beyond her immediate family and students to the broader school community where she had been a unifying force. She had established partnerships with local businesses to secure school supplies for children whose families couldn't afford them, created a clothing exchange program for rapidly growing students, and organized cultural celebration days to honor the diverse heritage of the school's population. Fellow teacher Maria Gonzalez recalled how Gabrielle would spend weekends visiting the homes of students who were falling behind, working with their families to create supportive learning environments. "She understood that education doesn't stop at the classroom door," Gonzalez explained during a school board meeting where a resolution was passed to name the school library in Gabrielle's honor. The irony that Gabrielle had been a vocal advocate for traffic safety in the school zone was not lost on her colleagues and the parents of her students. Just months before her death, she had successfully petitioned the city to install additional crosswalks and speed bumps near Sunnyside Elementary after a student was nearly struck by a car while walking to school. She had organized a student safety patrol and created colorful posters reminding drivers to slow down in school zones, efforts that made her death by a speeding driver all the more tragic. The crossing where Gabrielle was killed would later be renamed Torres Crossing and equipped with enhanced safety features, including solar-powered flashing lights, a change that community members noted came too late to save the woman who had advocated for such improvements. Gabrielle's children, Elena and Marco, aged 10 and 8 at the time of her death, became the emotional center of the community's response to the tragedy. Elena, who had inherited her mother's academic aptitude and determination, struggled to maintain her previously excellent grades as she processed her grief, while Marco, the more sensitive of the two, stopped speaking entirely for nearly 3 weeks after learning of his mother's death. Child psychologists worked with both children to help them navigate their trauma, using art therapy and guided journaling to express feelings they couldn't verbalize. In one particularly moving drawing presented during the victim impact statement portion of the trial, Marco had depicted his mother as an angel watching over his school, a halo of books surrounding her head. The economic reality of Gabrielle's death created additional hardship for her family, as she had been the primary provider for her children while receiving only minimal child support from their father, who had moved to California years earlier and maintained limited contact. A GoFundMe campaign organized by Sunnyside Elementary staff raised over $60,000 to establish college funds for Elena and Marco, with hundreds of small donations coming from current and former students' families, many of whom had limited financial resources themselves, but wanted to honor Gabrielle's dedication to educational opportunity. Local education advocate and philanthropist Sandra Morrison matched these donations, ensuring that Gabrielle's children would have the educational opportunities their mother had worked so hard to provide. The first 911 call reporting the hit and run came from Mohammed Farouki, the owner of a convenience store located approximately 50 yards from the crosswalk, where Gabrielle was struck. "I need an ambulance right away," Faruqi told the dispatcher, his voice shaking as he described the scene. "A car just hit a woman and drove off. She's not moving at all." The call, time-stamped at 9:48 in the evening, brought first responders to the scene within 6 minutes, though. Paramedics quickly determined that Gabrielle's injuries were catastrophic and incompatible with life. Officers secured a perimeter around the crash site as the busy intersection was transformed into a somber crime scene with the scattered contents of Gabrielle's tote bag, lesson plans, children's artwork, and a half-eaten energy bar, creating a poignant tableau on the darkened asphalt. Detective Nathaniel Reed arrived at the scene at 10:23 that evening, by which time the Phoenix Police Department had already begun the standard protocols for a fatal hit-and-run investigation. The first 24 hours are critical in cases like this, Reed would later explain during a press briefing. Witnesses' memories are freshest, physical evidence hasn't been compromised by weather or time, and there's a better chance the vehicle involved still shows damage that can connect it to the scene. The detective's initial assessment noted several promising leads. Multiple witnesses had described a red sedan with front-end damage speeding away from the scene. Fragments of a headlight assembly had been recovered from the roadway, and surveillance footage from the convenience store, though grainy, had captured a partial view of the collision. Despite these initial leads, the investigation faced significant challenges, including the limited quality of the surveillance footage and the fact that none of the witnesses had been able to see the license plate clearly. The crime scene technicians worked meticulously through the night under portable floodlights, their efforts complicated by the busy nature of the intersection and the environmental conditions typical of Phoenix in September. The temperature that night remained above 90 degrees until well after midnight, creating concerns about the degradation of biological evidence. Heat accelerates decomposition of biological materials and can affect the integrity of certain types of physical evidence, explained forensic technician Jasmine Parech, who led the evidence collection team. The technicians photographed and mapped the scene using three-dimensional scanning technology, collected paint samples and vehicle fragments, and measured skid patterns, or more significantly, the lack thereof, which suggested the driver had not attempted to brake before or immediately after impact. The medical examiner, Dr. Lawrence Chen, conducted a preliminary examination at the scene before Gabrielle's body was transported to the county morgue for a full autopsy. His initial findings, noted in the crime scene report, indicated that Gabrielle had suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma consistent with high-velocity impact from a motor vehicle, including multiple fractures, internal injuries, and head trauma. The position of Gabrielle's body and the distribution of her belongings across the scene allowed accident reconstruction specialists to estimate that the vehicle had been traveling between 50 and 55 miles per hour at the time of impact, well above the posted 35-mile-per-hour speed limit. The medical examiner's report would later confirm that death had been instantaneous, a detail that provided small comfort to Gabrielle's family amid their devastating loss. By dawn on September 20th, Detective Reed had established a command center for the investigation at the Phoenix Police Department's Desert Horizon Precinct, where he assembled a team including 2 additional detectives, a forensic analyst, and liaison officers to work with the Traffic Division and Public Information Office. Their first priority was canvassing for additional surveillance footage from businesses along East McDowell Road that might have captured the vehicle before or after the collision. This effort yielded footage from an automotive parts store 3 blocks east of the crash site, showing a red sedan with front-end damage passing by at approximately 9:51 that evening, though the image quality was insufficient to identify the license plate. The team also began the painstaking process of interviewing the 16 witnesses who had either seen the collision or its immediate aftermath, working to reconcile sometimes contradictory descriptions of the vehicle and its direction of travel. The investigation received its first major breakthrough when technicians processing evidence from the scene identified the headlight fragments as belonging to a 2015 or 2016 Lexus ES model, narrowing the search parameters significantly. This information was immediately distributed to local auto body shops, junkyards, and dealerships with a request to report any red Lexus sedans brought in with front-end damage. Detective Reed also arranged for the department's public information officer to hold a press conference appealing for information, which resulted in several tips from the public, including one from a bartender at a sports bar near Arcadia, who reported overhearing teenagers discussing a hit-and-run while watching news coverage of Gabrielle's death. Though this tip initially seemed promising, it ultimately led to unrelated high school students who had been speculating about the case rather than sharing insider knowledge. The foundational clue that would ultimately break the case came not from the scene itself, but from the methodical review of traffic enforcement cameras in the surrounding area. Traffic Division Officer Marina Delgado, assigned to review red light camera footage from intersections within a 2-mile radius of the crash site, discovered images from a camera at East McDowell Road and North 44th Street, approximately half a mile from where Gabrielle was struck. The footage, captured at 9:45 that evening, showed a red Lexus ES with the license plate clearly visible and, more significantly, provided a clear image of the driver, a young female with blonde hair who appeared to be looking down at a mobile device rather than at the road ahead. This critical evidence transformed the investigation from a search for an unknown suspect to a focused pursuit of a specifically identified vehicle and driver. When Officer Delgado brought the traffic camera footage to Detective Reed's attention, he immediately recognized its potential significance. "This is exactly the kind of break we needed," Reed noted in his case log after reviewing the evidence. The license plate visible in the footage was registered to Robert and Margaret Johnson of Paradise Valley, an affluent suburb northeast of Phoenix proper. Background checks revealed that the Johnsons had a 16-year-old daughter, Emma, whose driver's license photo appeared to match the individual captured by the traffic camera. Further investigation into Emma's social media accounts yielded multiple posts from the evening of September 19th, including check-ins at a house party in Arcadia beginning at approximately 6:30 that evening and continuing until just after 9. Armed with the traffic camera evidence and social media documentation suggesting Emma's whereabouts and activities that evening, Detective Reed secured a search warrant for the Johnson residence, which was executed at 11:15 on the morning of September 23rd. The warrant specifically authorized the seizure of the red Lexus sedan, Emma's mobile devices, and any clothing that might contain evidence related to the collision. When officers arrived at the expansive Paradise Valley home, they found Margaret Johnson alone, her husband at work, and her daughter at school. Mrs. Johnson appeared visibly shaken by the officers' arrival and, according to the official report, repeatedly asked, "Is this about Emma's accident?" before being informed of the specific nature of the investigation. The search of the Johnson residence proved initially disappointing for investigators, as the red Lexus sedan was not on the property. Margaret Johnson claimed the vehicle had been taken to a dealership for routine maintenance, though she was unable to immediately provide documentation or specify which dealership was servicing the car. A search of the family's 3-car garage, however, revealed what forensic technicians described as apparent attempts to clean a specific area of the floor, with chemical traces indicating the recent use of industrial-strength cleaning products. Technicians also discovered red paint scrapings and small fragments of plastic consistent with headlight material in a workshop trash can, items that would later be matched to both the Lexus model and evidence collected from the crash site. While the search was ongoing, Detective Reed interviewed Margaret Johnson, whose account contained numerous inconsistencies that raised immediate suspicions. She initially claimed her daughter had been home studying on the evening of September 19th, then amended her statement to say Emma had attended a friend's house for a study group but had been driven by a parent and had not had access to any vehicle that night. When confronted with Emma's social media posts showing her at a party, Mrs. Johnson became evasive, stating that she couldn't keep track of every place her daughter went, and suggesting that the posts might have been made from home to give the appearance of social activity. The most damning moment in the interview came when Reed showed her the traffic camera image of Emma behind the wheel at 9:45 that evening, at which point Mrs. Johnson abruptly stated, "I need to call our lawyer," and terminated the interview. The traffic camera footage showing 16-year-old Emma Johnson behind the wheel of her parents' red Lexus just minutes before Gabrielle Torres was killed transformed the investigation's trajectory overnight. Detective Nathaniel Reed, reviewing the evidence with his team, was struck by the clear image of Emma looking down at what appeared to be her phone while driving through the intersection. The timestamp on the footage placed the vehicle less than half a mile from the crash site, approximately 2 minutes before the collision, creating a timeline that aligned perfectly with witness statements and the 911 call. The image quality was exceptional for traffic camera footage, clearly showing Emma's distinctive features, including her long blonde hair and a small star tattoo visible on her left wrist, a detail that would later be confirmed through her social media photos and school records. Emma's digital footprint quickly became a central focus of the investigation, with detectives obtaining warrants for her social media accounts, text messages, and location data from her mobile devices. The digital evidence painted a disturbing picture of the hours leading up to the fatal collision, starting with a series of posts from a house party in Arcadia hosted by a classmate whose parents were out of town. Photos and videos posted by Emma and others at the party clearly showed underage drinking, with Emma visible in multiple images holding alcoholic beverages, and in one particularly damning video posted at 8:36 that evening, declaring herself the designated driver while visibly intoxicated. Location data from her phone corroborated her presence at the party from approximately 6:30 until 9:15, when the device began moving toward the area where Gabrielle would be struck half an hour later. Text messages recovered from Emma's phone revealed messages sent to friends after the collision, including one sent at 10:32 that evening that read, "OMG, just got home, hit something on McDowell, car's messed up, parents are going to kill me." Another message sent minutes later to a different friend stated, "Might have hit someone, not sure, was too scared to stop." These messages directly contradicted the story Emma had told her parents about hitting a deer, suggesting she had been aware that she had struck a person but had made a conscious decision to flee the scene. Perhaps most disturbing to investigators were messages exchanged with friends the following day after news of Gabrielle's death had been reported, in which Emma asked if they could trace it back to her and discussed ways to create an alibi. While Detective Reed was building the case against Emma Johnson, a parallel investigation was developing around her parents' actions in the hours and days following the collision. Cell phone records showed that Robert Johnson had made multiple calls to auto body shops on the morning after the crash, eventually arranging for the damaged Lexus to be taken to a small, cash-only repair facility in a remote industrial area of Scottsdale. The owner of this facility, Victor Mendoza, initially denied servicing the vehicle when questioned by police, but changed his story when informed that concealing evidence in a homicide investigation could result in accessory charges. Mendoza then provided investigators with detailed information about the damage to the vehicle, which he described as consistent with pedestrian impact, and admitted that Robert Johnson had specifically requested no documentation of the repairs and had paid a premium for expedited service. The Johnson family's financial records revealed further evidence of their attempts to conceal Emma's involvement in the fatal collision. Credit card statements showed purchases from an automotive supply store specializing in detailing products on the morning after the crash, including industrial-strength cleaning solutions, specialized tools for removing fabric and carpet, and a new floor mat set for a Lexus ES. Store surveillance footage confirmed that Robert Johnson had made these purchases personally, appearing visibly anxious during the transaction, according to the clerk who assisted him. Bank records also showed a cash withdrawal of $8,000 from the Johnsons' joint account on September 20th, which aligned with the estimated cost of the undocumented repairs to the vehicle. When detectives finally located the red Lexus at Mendoza's repair shop on September 24th, the vehicle had already undergone significant restoration, including replacement of the entire front bumper assembly, headlight, and hood. Despite these efforts, forensic technicians were able to recover crucial evidence from the undercarriage and wheel wells of the vehicle, where trace evidence including fibers matching Gabrielle Torres's clothing and microscopic blood samples were discovered. The vehicle's onboard computer system also provided investigators with valuable data, including confirmation that the Lexus had been traveling at 52 miles per hour at the time of impact, and that there had been no application of brakes until several seconds after the collision, supporting the theory that Emma had been distracted and impaired when she struck Gabrielle. The portrait of Emma Johnson that emerged during the investigation stood in stark contrast to her public persona as a high-achieving student from a respected family. Interviews with classmates and teachers revealed a troubling pattern of entitlement and manipulation, masked by a carefully cultivated image of academic success and social popularity. "There were always two Emmas," explained her former math teacher, who requested anonymity during the investigation. There was the charming, intelligent student who would volunteer answers in class, and then there was the calculating young woman who thought rules didn't apply to her and who I caught cheating on tests multiple times. Multiple classmates described instances of Emma pressuring others to complete assignments for her, using a combination of social leverage and subtle threats to maintain her academic standing without putting in the work herself. Emma's history with alcohol and driving emerged as a particular concern, with friends reluctantly admitting that the party on September 19th had not been her first experience with intoxicated driving. One former friend, granted immunity in exchange for her testimony, revealed that Emma had been involved in a minor collision 3 months earlier after drinking at a graduation party, an incident that had been handled privately when her parents paid for damages to the other vehicle, without involving insurance or police. This friend described Emma as obsessed with her image and getting away with things, recalling how the teenager had bragged about her parents' willingness to fix any problem she encountered. The investigation also uncovered a previously unreported incident in which Emma had been stopped for speeding 6 weeks before the fatal collision, but had been released with a warning after what one friend described as turning on the waterworks for the officer. The Johnson family's affluence and standing in the community became a focal point for both the investigation and the subsequent media coverage of the case. Robert Johnson was a successful investment banker with a prominent Phoenix firm, while Margaret Johnson served on multiple charitable foundation boards and was active in local politics. Their sprawling Paradise Valley home, valued at over $3 million, became a visual symbol in news coverage of the case, often juxtaposed with images of the modest apartment complex where Gabrielle Torres had lived with her children. This stark contrast fueled public discourse about privilege, accountability, and the perception of a two-tiered justice system, with community activists expressing concern that the Johnsons' resources and connections might allow their daughter to escape appropriate consequences for her actions. Detective Reed's approach to building the case against Emma Johnson was methodical and comprehensive, designed to counter the expected defense strategies from the high-priced legal team the Johnson family had immediately retained. We knew from the beginning that this would not be a typical prosecution. Reed later explained during a law enforcement conference where the case was presented as a study in thorough investigation. We anticipated arguments about chain of custody, admissibility of evidence, and attempts to shift responsibility away from Emma herself, so every element of our case needed to be ironclad. This approach included obtaining multiple search warrants rather than relying on consent searches, documenting every step of the evidence collection process with video recordings, and building redundancies into the evidence chain so that the case did not depend solely on any single piece of evidence. The arrest warrant for Emma Johnson was issued on September 25th, 6 days after the fatal collision, with charges including vehicular manslaughter, driving under the influence, leaving the scene of a fatal accident, and tampering with evidence. Despite having been made aware of the investigation, the Johnson family appeared surprised when officers arrived at their home to take Emma into custody, with Margaret Johnson repeatedly asking if there had been some mistake. Emma herself was arrested while preparing to leave for school, dressed in her private school uniform and exhibiting what the arresting officers described as an unnerving calm as she was handcuffed and informed of her rights. Her only reported comment during the arrest was addressed to her mother. "Call Dad and tell him to handle this like the dear thing last year," a statement that would later be interpreted by prosecutors as evidence of a pattern of parental intervention to shield Emma from consequences. Robert and Margaret Johnson were also arrested that same day, charged initially as accessories after the fact for their alleged roles in concealing evidence and obstructing the investigation. The family was processed separately at the Maricopa County Jail, with Emma being held in the juvenile detention section due to her age, despite the prosecutor's immediate announcement of intention to try her as an adult, given the severity of the charges. The arrests generated significant media attention, with local news stations broadcasting footage of the three Johnsons being escorted into the courthouse for their initial appearances. The images of Emma, still in her school uniform, with her hands cuffed in front of her, became iconic in the local coverage of the case, particularly when contrasted with her apparent lack of emotional reaction to the proceedings. Prosecutor Sophia Phillips approached the case against Emma Johnson with a methodical strategy centered on the traffic camera footage that placed the teenager behind the wheel minutes before the fatal collision. "This piece of evidence is unassailable," Phillips explained to her team during strategy sessions, documented in her case notes. The camera captured not just the vehicle and license plate, but Emma's face clearly visible through the windshield, looking down at what appears to be her phone, rather than at the road ahead. The timestamp on the footage created a perfect timeline when combined with the 911 call reporting Gabrielle Torres's death, leaving a window of just over 2 minutes between Emma passing through the camera-monitored intersection and the fatal impact half a mile down the road. Accident reconstruction experts confirmed that the timing aligned perfectly with the estimated speed of the vehicle, creating what Phillips called a chain of evidence that leaves no room for reasonable doubt. The prosecution team assembled a comprehensive digital narrative of Emma's activities on the evening of September 19th, beginning with her arrival at the house party in Arcadia and ending with her return home after the collision. Social media posts from Emma and her friends established her presence at the party from 6:30 until approximately 9:15 that evening, with multiple images and videos showing her consuming alcoholic beverages. Location data from her phone corroborated this timeline and tracked her movement from the party toward the area where Gabrielle was struck. Perhaps most damaging were text messages recovered from Emma's phone, including one sent to a friend at 8:52 that evening stating, "So drunk but gotta drive home, parents need car TMRW," and another sent at 10:32 shortly after arriving home, mentioning hitting something and damage to the vehicle. To establish Emma's level of intoxication at the time of the collision, prosecutors worked with toxicology experts who analyzed the available evidence to create a retroactive blood alcohol estimate. Using Emma's weight, 122 pounds according to her driver's license, the documented alcohol consumption visible in social media posts, and the timing between her last drink and the collision, experts estimated her blood alcohol concentration would have been between 0.15 and 0.18%, approximately twice the legal limit for adult drivers and well above the zero-tolerance threshold for drivers under 21. This analysis was supplemented by testimony from party attendees who described Emma as visibly drunk and slurring her words before she left the gathering, with one witness recalling having offered to call her an Uber, an offer Emma had declined. The case against Emma was strengthened by evidence of the extensive cover-up attempt that followed the collision, which prosecutors argued demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Forensic analysis of the Johnson family's home computers revealed Internet searches from the morning after the crash, including How to Fix Car Front-End Damage, Hit and Run Penalties Arizona, and Can Police Track Car from Paint Fragments. Cell phone records showed that Robert Johnson had made multiple calls to auto body shops on September 20th, eventually arranging for the damaged Lexus to be taken to Victor Mendoza's cash-only repair facility. Credit card statements documented purchases of cleaning supplies and replacement car parts, while bank records showed a large cash withdrawal coinciding with the estimated cost of the undocumented repairs. Victor Mendoza's testimony became a crucial element in the prosecution's case as he provided detailed information about the damage to the Lexus and the Johnson family's efforts to have it repaired quickly and discreetly. Initially hesitant to cooperate with investigators due to concerns about his own legal exposure, Mendoza eventually agreed to testify in exchange for immunity on potential charges related to evidence tampering. His testimony included descriptions of the vehicle's damage, which he characterized as consistent with pedestrian impact, and recounting conversations with Robert Johnson, in which the father had explicitly requested no documentation of the repairs and had offered a substantial premium for expedited service. Mendoza also preserved photographs of the damaged vehicle before repairs began, images that would later be matched by forensic experts to the injuries sustained by Gabrielle Torres. Physical evidence recovered from the Lexus, despite the family's cleaning efforts, provided the final links in the prosecution's chain of evidence. Forensic technicians discovered traces of Gabrielle's DNA on the undercarriage of the vehicle, along with fibers from her clothing embedded in crevices that had not been thoroughly cleaned. The vehicle's onboard computer system yielded critical data about its speed and braking patterns at the time of impact, confirming it had been traveling at 52 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, and that the brakes had not been applied until several seconds after the collision. This technical evidence corroborated witness statements about the vehicle speeding away from the scene and supported the prosecution's narrative that Emma had been too impaired to respond appropriately to the collision. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors faced a strategic decision regarding charges against Robert and Margaret Johnson, who had initially been arrested as accessories after the fact. After extensive interviews and review of the evidence, it became apparent that while both parents had participated in concealing evidence after learning of the collision, their levels of knowledge and involvement differed significantly. We began to see a pattern suggesting that Emma had manipulated her parents, particularly her mother, using a combination of lies, emotional manipulation, and exploitation of their protective instincts, Phillips explained in a later interview. This emerging understanding led to a pivotal shift in the prosecution's approach, offering the parents reduced charges in exchange for their testimony about Emma's actions and statements after the collision. The decision to offer plea deals to Robert and Margaret Johnson was controversial, drawing criticism from some members of Gabriel Torres's family who believed all three family members should face maximum penalties. Prosecutor Phillips defended the strategy as necessary to ensure justice for Gabrielle, explaining, "Our primary objective was building an airtight case against the person directly responsible for taking Gabrielle's life, and the parents' testimony was crucial to establishing Emma's state of mind, her awareness of having struck a person rather than an animal, and her calculated efforts to escape consequences." The plea agreements required both parents to provide full and truthful testimony about all aspects of the case, to plead guilty to reduced charges of obstruction of justice, and to make significant restitution payments to Gabrielle's Children's Education Fund. When Robert and Margaret Johnson accepted the plea deals and agreed to testify against their daughter, the dynamic of the case shifted dramatically. Their statements to prosecutors revealed a disturbing pattern of manipulation by Emma, who had initially claimed to have hit a deer, but later admitted to her parents that she had struck a person after they confronted her with news reports about Gabrielle's death. According to their testimony, Emma had become coldly calculating in the aftermath, instructing them on how to clean the vehicle, suggesting specific repair shops known for discretion, and reminding them repeatedly that family protects family and that no one can prove anything if we stick together. Margaret Johnson's statement included the revelation that Emma had threatened to implicate her parents as having been the actual drivers if they did not help conceal her involvement, exploiting their fear of legal consequences to ensure their complicity. The final component of the prosecution's case against Emma Johnson focused on establishing her motive for fleeing the scene rather than stopping to render aid to Gabrielle. Through interviews with Emma's friends and analysis of her digital communications, prosecutors built a narrative of a teenager obsessively concerned with her image and future prospects, who made a split-second calculation that her college ambitions and social standing would be better served by attempting to escape accountability than by accepting responsibility for a tragic accident. Text messages sent in the days following the collision showed Emma researching the penalties for hit and run versus DUI manslaughter, concluding that running was definitely the right call, in a message to a close friend. This evidence of calculated self-interest, rather than panic or confusion, was central to the prosecution's characterization of Emma as someone who valued her own convenience above Gabriel Torres's life. Emma Johnson's arrest on the morning of September 25, 2016, unfolded with a choreographed precision that reflected the high-profile nature of the case and the potential for media scrutiny. Detective Nathaniel Reed had coordinated with the Phoenix Police Department's Special Assignments Unit to ensure that the arrest would be conducted professionally and safely, with consideration given to both the seriousness of the charges and Emma's age. The officers arrived at the Johnson residence in Paradise Valley at 6:45 in the morning, timing the arrest to coincide with when Emma would be preparing for school, but before local news helicopters would be likely to be airborne. The team of 6 officers, including 2 female detectives assigned to directly handle Emma, approached the front door with a clear arrest plan that had been rehearsed to minimize the potential for confrontation or flight. When officers knocked on the door, it was Margaret Johnson who answered, her expression shifting from irritation to visible shock as Detective Reed identified himself and stated the purpose of their visit. "There must be some mistake," she repeated several times, attempting to close the door until informed that they had a warrant for Emma's arrest on charges including vehicular manslaughter. Body camera footage from the arresting officers captured Margaret calling upstairs, "Emma, stay in your room," before being firmly instructed to cooperate with the officers. Emma herself appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, dressed in her private school uniform, a pleated skirt and blazer bearing the crest of an exclusive preparatory academy. with her backpack slung over one shoulder, as if this were a normal school day. The contrast between her polished appearance and the gravity of the situation was striking to the officers present, one of whom later described her demeanor as unnervingly composed, like she was expecting us but didn't think we'd actually go through with it. As the female detectives approached Emma to place her under arrest, reading her Miranda rights and explaining the charges, the teenager's face remained almost expressionless, betraying only a fleeting tightness around her mouth that suggested controlled anger rather than fear. Her only spoken response came when Detective Alicia Morales informed her that she would be transported to the Maricopa County Juvenile Detention Center for processing, at which point Emma turned to her mother and stated calmly, "Call Dad and tell him to handle this like the deer thing last year." This statement, captured on body camera footage, would later be highlighted by prosecutors as evidence of a pattern of parental intervention to shield Emma from consequences of her actions. Margaret Johnson, visibly shaken, attempted to embrace her daughter before she was led away, but Emma stepped back, saying only, "Don't make a scene, Mom. Just call Dad and the lawyers." Emma was transported to the Maricopa County Juvenile Detention Center in a marked police vehicle, seated in the back with her hands cuffed in front of her rather than behind her back, a courtesy extended due to her age and the absence of any perceived flight risk. Throughout the 20-minute drive, officers noted that she remained silent, staring out the window with what one described as an almost bored expression. Upon arrival at the detention center, Emma was processed according to standard procedures, including fingerprinting, photographing, and changing from her school uniform into the facility's standard jumpsuit. The booking photograph captured during this process, showing Emma with her blonde hair pulled back, her expression neutral but with a slight lift at the corner of her mouth that many would later interpret as a smirk, would become one of the defining images of the case in media coverage. The initial interrogation of Emma Johnson was conducted by Detective Reed and a juvenile crime specialist, Detective Marta Vasquez, in a specialized interview room designed for juvenile suspects with appropriate accommodations, including the presence of a child advocate as required by Arizona law for the questioning of minors. Emma had been informed that her parents had arranged for an attorney, Lawrence Bartlett, one of Phoenix's most prominent criminal defense lawyers, but she elected to speak with detectives before his arrival, a decision that would later be scrutinized during pre-trial hearings. The video recording of this interview revealed Emma's remarkable self-possession as she sat with perfect posture, hands folded on the table before her, responding to questions with carefully measured statements that appeared rehearsed and designed to distance herself from responsibility. When Detective Reed opened the questioning by asking Emma about her whereabouts on the evening of September 19th, she provided a calmly delivered account that differed significantly from the evidence already gathered by investigators. "I was at a friend's house, studying for our AP biology test until about 8:30. Then my mom picked me up and I went straight home to finish a paper that was due the next day," Emma stated, making direct eye contact with Reed throughout. When asked if she had been driving the family's red Lexus at any point that evening, she responded without hesitation, "No, I didn't drive it all that night. My mom doesn't like me driving after dark." These statements directly contradicted the traffic camera footage, witness accounts, and location data from her phone, but were delivered with such conviction that Detective Vasquez would later remark in her case notes that Emma lied with a fluency and confidence that was disturbing in someone so young. The pivotal moment in the interrogation came when Detective Reed placed a printed still image from the traffic camera footage on the table between them, showing Emma clearly visible behind the wheel of the red Lexus at 9:45 that evening. "This is you driving through the intersection of McDowell and 44th Street, less than 2 minutes before Gabrielle Torres was struck and killed," Reed stated, watching Emma's reaction carefully. For the first time, Emma's composed facade cracked momentarily, her pupils dilated, her breathing visibly accelerated, and she pulled her hands back from the table into her lap where the cameras could not capture what was likely clenching. This physiological reaction lasted only seconds before Emma regained her composure, but the momentary lapse was noted by both detectives as significant. Emma's response to the traffic camera evidence revealed a calculated pivot in her strategy. "I don't think I should say anything else without my lawyer present," she stated, her voice betraying a slight tremor despite her evident effort to maintain control. When Detective Reed acknowledged her right to counsel but asked if she wished to explain the discrepancy between her previous statement and the photographic evidence, Emma simply repeated, "I want my lawyer now," and folded her arms across her chest. The detectives respected this invocation of her rights, suspending the interview until attorney Lawrence Bartlett arrived approximately 40 minutes later, at which point Emma declined to answer any further questions on his advice. While Emma waited for her attorney, detectives observed her through the two-way mirror of the interview room, noting behaviors that contrasted sharply with her previous composed demeanor. Once alone, Emma was seen pacing the small room, repeatedly checking her reflection in the mirrored wall, and at one point appearing to practice facial expressions that shifted from distress to neutrality, and back again. She also attempted to use the interview room phone to make a call, becoming visibly frustrated when informed by the monitoring officer that calls needed to be arranged through proper channels. These unguarded moments, captured on the interview room's continuous recording system, provided investigators with valuable insights into Emma's character and concerns, suggesting she was more preoccupied with managing perceptions than with the fate of Gabriel Torres. The contrast between Emma's behavior during questioning and her parents' response to their own interrogations was striking to investigators. While Emma had maintained a cool detachment and calculated responses, both Robert and Margaret Johnson had displayed visible distress, with Margaret breaking down in tears several times during her interview, and Robert appearing physically ill when confronted with evidence of their efforts to conceal their daughter's involvement in the fatal collision. Detective Reed noted in his case report that the parents exhibited the emotional reactions one would expect from people confronting the gravity of a situation involving death and potential imprisonment, whereas Emma had shown an emotional flatness and self-focus that was deeply incongruous with the circumstances. Following the suspended interrogation, Emma was detained at the juvenile facility pending her initial court appearance, which was scheduled for the following morning. During this period, she was placed under suicide watch as a standard precaution for juveniles facing serious charges, despite showing no indications of self-harm risk. Detention center staff reported that Emma requested several unusual accommodations during her first night in custody, including asking for her own cell rather than shared housing, inquiring whether she could wear her own clothes to court rather than the facility's jumpsuit, and repeatedly asking for access to a mirror and hairbrush. One staff member described her as more concerned with how she would look in court than with what might happen to her there, an observation that aligned with the emerging psychological profile being developed by the prosecution team. Emma's initial court appearance on September 26th provided the first opportunity for the public to see her in person, as Maricopa County's juvenile court proceedings were open to the media in cases involving serious felony charges. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with journalists and members of the community seated alongside representatives from Gabriel Torres's family and Emma's extended family. Emma was led into the courtroom wearing the standard juvenile detention jumpsuit, but observers noted that her hair had been carefully styled, and she had somehow managed to apply subtle makeup despite the facility's restrictions. As Judge Maria Hernandez read the charges against her, including vehicular manslaughter, driving under the influence, Leaving the scene of a fatal accident and tampering with evidence, Emma maintained the same composed expression she had shown during her arrest, occasionally whispering to her attorney, but showing no visible reaction to the gravity of the allegations or the potential consequences she faced. The most revealing moment during this initial hearing came when prosecutor Sophia Phillips requested that Emma be held without bail, citing the serious nature of the charges, the evidence of a cover-up attempt indicating flight risk, and the potential for witness intimidation given Emma's documented communications with friends about creating false alibis. As Phillips detailed the evidence against her, including the traffic camera footage and DNA findings, Emma's expression shifted subtly from neutrality to what several courtroom observers described as a dismissive smirk. This expression, captured by courtroom cameras and splashed across local news broadcasts that evening, became a defining image of the case, reinforcing public perception of Emma as coldly detached from the tragedy she had caused. Judge Hernandez ultimately ordered Emma to be held on $3 million bail and announced that she would be tried as an adult given the severity of the charges, a decision that visibly surprised Emma, despite her efforts to maintain her composed facade. The trial of 16-year-old Emma Johnson began on February 13, 2017, nearly 5 months after the fatal collision that took Gabriel Torres's life on a Phoenix crosswalk. The Maricopa County Superior Court was filled to capacity as Judge Raymond Chen entered the courtroom with extra seating, arranged to accommodate the unprecedented public interest in the case. Local media had been covering the proceedings extensively since Emma's arrest, with the case becoming a flashpoint for discussions about privilege, accountability, and juvenile justice in Arizona. Seated at the defense table, Emma presented a carefully cultivated image of youth and innocence, wearing a modest navy blue dress with a white collar that resembled a school uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wearing minimal makeup that emphasized her youthful appearance. Prosecutor Sophia Phillips's opening statement was delivered with measured precision, mapping out a narrative that began with Emma's documented alcohol consumption at a house party and ended with Gabriel Torres's body being discovered on East McDowell Road. "This case is about choices," Phillips told the jury, maintaining steady eye contact with each member as she moved across the courtroom. The choice to drink underage, the choice to drive while impaired, the choice to flee the scene of a fatal collision rather than rendering aid, and the subsequent choices to orchestrate an elaborate cover-up rather than taking responsibility. Throughout this powerful opening, cameras in the courtroom captured Emma's reaction, or more tellingly, her lack of reaction, as she maintained an expression of mild interest that occasionally shifted to what many observers described as a subtle smirk when Phillips detailed the evidence against her, particularly when mentioning the traffic camera footage that would become central to the prosecution's case. Defense attorney Lawrence Bartlett countered with an opening statement that sought to portray Emma as a frightened teenager who had made a terrible mistake, but who had not been driving under the influence as charged. What happened on September 19th was a tragic accident, not a crime, Bartlett argued, pacing deliberately before the jury. Emma Johnson was indeed behind the wheel when this horrible accident occurred, but she was not intoxicated, and her decision to leave the scene, while admittedly wrong, was made in a moment of panic and confusion that we must view through the lens of adolescent psychology rather than adult standards of behavior. Throughout his statement, Bartlett repeatedly emphasized Emma's age, referring to her as this child and this young girl, language clearly intended to remind jurors that despite being tried as an adult, the defendant was chronologically and developmentally an adolescent. The most dramatic moment of the opening day came when Phillips presented the traffic camera footage showing Emma behind the wheel at 9:45 that evening, just minutes before the fatal collision. The high-definition footage projected on a large screen visible to the entire courtroom, showed Emma clearly looking down at what appeared to be her phone rather than at the road ahead, her face illuminated by the device's screen. This is not the face of someone who is attentive to the road, not the face of someone meeting their responsibility as a driver, Phillips told the jury, freezing the frame on Emma's distracted expression. As this damning evidence was presented, courtroom observers noted that Emma leaned over to whisper something to her attorney, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. A reaction that appeared incongruous with the gravity of the moment, and that was captured by courtroom cameras, becoming one of the defining images of the trial in subsequent media coverage. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Mohammed Faruqi, the convenience store owner who had placed the first 911 call reporting the collision. Faruqi provided a vivid account of hearing the impact from inside his store, rushing outside to see Gabrielle Torres's body on the pavement and glimpsing the red sedan speeding away without stopping. "I ran to her right away, but I could see she was very badly hurt," Faruqi testified, his voice breaking slightly as he recalled attempting to find a pulse before realizing the extent of Gabrielle's injuries. There was nothing anyone could have done for her at that point. During this emotional testimony, Emma was observed taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally glancing up at Faruqi with what one juror would later describe as cold curiosity rather than remorse or distress. The medical evidence was presented by Dr. Lawrence Chen, the medical examiner who had performed Gabrielle's autopsy. Using anatomical diagrams rather than the graphic autopsy photographs to spare the Torres family further trauma, Dr. Chen detailed the catastrophic injuries Gabrielle had suffered, including multiple fractures, severe internal injuries, and traumatic brain injury that had resulted in instant death. Based on the pattern and extent of injuries, Dr. Chen testified, the vehicle was traveling at high speed at the time of impact, and the victim would have died almost instantly. He further testified that, had emergency medical services been called immediately, the outcome would not have changed given the severity of Gabrielle's injuries, a point the defense would later attempt to use to mitigate the significance of Emma's decision to flee the scene rather than stopping to render aid. Forensic technical evidence formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, beginning with testimony from Officer Marina Delgado, who had discovered the crucial traffic camera footage that placed Emma at the scene. Delgado walked the jury through the process of reviewing intersection cameras in the vicinity of the collision, explaining how the timestamp and location data created a perfect timeline matching witness accounts of the incident. The vehicle passes through the intersection at East McDowell Road and North 44th Street at precisely 9:45 and 13 seconds, Delgado testified, and based on the vehicle's speed and the distance to the collision site, it would have reached the location where Ms. Torres was struck at approximately 9:47, which aligns exactly with the timestamp of the first 911 call at 9:48. Accident reconstruction specialist Thomas Harrington provided expert testimony about the physical evidence collected from the scene, including skid mark analysis indicating that the driver had not attempted to brake until several seconds after impact. Using computer modeling and animation, Harrington demonstrated how the collision had occurred, showing the jury that a sober, attentive driver would have had ample time to see Gabrielle in the crosswalk and stop safely. Based on the environmental conditions that night, clear weather, dry roads, functioning street lighting, and the victim's position in a marked crosswalk wearing light-colored clothing, an attentive driver traveling at the posted speed limit would have been able to perceive, react, and stop approximately 27 feet before reaching the crosswalk, Harrington testified. The evidence indicates that the vehicle that struck Ms. Torres was traveling approximately 52 miles per hour, 17 miles over the speed limit, and that no braking occurred until after impact. The prosecution's presentation of digital evidence revealed the extent of Emma's activities before and after the collision. Digital forensics expert Aidan Carpenter testified about data recovered from Emma's phone, including location tracking that placed her at the party from 6:30 until 9:15 that evening, followed by movement along the route where Gabrielle was struck. Carpenter also presented a series of text messages and social media posts showing Emma consuming alcohol at the party, including a video posted at 8:36 in which she slurred, "Designated driver tonight, wish me luck," while holding a bottle of vodka. Perhaps most damning were messages sent after the collision, including one to a friend at 10:32 that read, "OMG, just got home, hit something on McDowell, car's messed up, parents are going to kill me," and a follow-up sent minutes later stating, "Might have hit someone, not sure, was too scared to stop." As this digital evidence was presented, Emma's demeanor in the courtroom became increasingly concerning to observers. While her attorney maintained a professional composure despite the mounting evidence, Emma was observed whispering to him frequently, occasionally rolling her eyes during particularly damaging testimony, and at one point appearing to stifle a yawn while Carpenter described messages indicating her awareness that she might have struck a person rather than an object. These behaviors did not go unnoticed by the jury, with one juror later telling reporters that Emma's courtroom conduct had been as damning as any evidence presented, revealing what they perceived as a disturbing lack of remorse or appropriate gravity given the circumstances. The defense team's strategy became clear through their cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, focusing on three main arguments: challenging the accuracy of the blood alcohol estimation since no chemical test had been performed immediately after the collision, suggesting that Emma's decision to flee had been motivated by panic rather than callousness, and attempting to shift partial responsibility to Gabrielle Torres by questioning whether she had entered the crosswalk when the pedestrian signal indicated it was safe to do so. This last approach proved particularly controversial, with Judge Chen admonishing defense attorney Bartlett for a line of questioning that appeared to blame the victim without sufficient evidentiary basis. "Ms. Torres is not on trial here," Judge Chen stated firmly after sustaining one of Phillips's objections. "The evidence clearly establishes that she was in a marked crosswalk, and speculation about whether she had the right of way without supporting evidence is not appropriate." By the end of the first week of trial, the prosecution had presented a compelling narrative supported by technical evidence, witness testimony, and Emma's own digital footprint. The traffic camera footage showing Emma behind the wheel minutes before the collision, combined with the DNA evidence linking the Johnson family's Lexus to Gabrielle Torres's injuries, had effectively eliminated any question of Emma's direct involvement in the fatal hit-and-run. What remained in dispute was her level of intoxication, her awareness of having struck a person rather than an object, and the nature of the cover-up that followed, questions that would be addressed in the coming days as Robert and Margaret Johnson prepared to testify against their daughter under the terms of their plea agreements. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense as the first week of trial concluded, with clear divisions forming among the spectators. On one side sat Gabrielle Torres's family, including her parents, sister, and 2 children, their faces reflecting grief that had not diminished in the months since her death. On the other side were members of Emma's extended family and friends from her private school, their support for the defendant becoming increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted. Between these groups sat members of the media and public, many of whom had been following the case since Emma's arrest, and whose commentary was shaping public perception of a trial that had come to represent larger questions about justice, privilege, and accountability in the community. The most anticipated testimony of the trial came on the morning of February 21st, when Margaret Johnson took the stand to testify against her daughter as part of her plea agreement with the prosecution. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret was sworn in, her hands visibly trembling as she placed them on the Bible. Dressed conservatively in a gray suit, her once perfectly maintained appearance now showing signs of strain, she avoided looking at the defense table, where her daughter sat watching with an unreadable expression. Prosecutor Sophia Phillips began the questioning gently, establishing Margaret's background and relationship with Emma before moving to the events of September 19, 2016. When Emma came home that night, what did she tell you about where she had been and what had happened? Phillips asked, her tone measured but firm. Margaret's testimony revealed a disturbing account of manipulation and calculated deception by her daughter in the aftermath of the collision. Emma came into the house around 10:30, visibly upset, saying she had hit a deer on McDowell Road and damaged the car, Margaret stated, her voice barely audible at times. She smelled of alcohol, which she denied when I asked her about it, claiming someone had spilled a drink on her at a study group. As Phillips guided her through the events of that evening and the following days, Margaret described how Emma's story had evolved, first claiming to have hit a deer, then acknowledging it might have been a dog, and finally admitting she had struck a person only after her parents confronted her with news reports about Gabriel Torres's death. The most damning portion of Margaret's testimony concerned Emma's reaction when confronted with the truth about what she had done. When we showed her the news article about Ms. Torres, Emma didn't cry or show remorse, Margaret testified, tears now streaming down her face. She became very cold and calculating, telling us that no one could prove she was driving unless we all stuck to the same story. According to Margaret, Emma had orchestrated the cover-up herself, instructing her parents on how to clean the vehicle, researching repair shops known for discretion, and creating a detailed false narrative for all three family members to follow. She told us exactly what to say if anyone asked questions, that she had been home studying all evening, and that Robert had been driving the car earlier and might have hit a deer. Phillips guided Margaret through the details of the cover-up, including Robert's efforts to repair the vehicle and their initial statements to police supporting Emma's fabricated alibi. Why did you participate in concealing evidence of your daughter's involvement in this fatal collision? Phillips asked, a question that caused Margaret to pause for several long moments before responding. It's difficult to explain, she finally answered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Part of it was shock and a parent's instinct to protect their child. But there was also fear. Emma made it clear that if we didn't help her, she would claim that one of us had been driving and had asked her to take the blame because she was a minor. This revelation of Emma's manipulation of her parents caused audible reactions in the courtroom, with several jurors visibly taken aback. Throughout her mother's testimony, Emma maintained the composed demeanor that had characterized her courtroom presence, occasionally whispering to her attorney, but showing no emotional reaction to her mother's distress or to the damning account of her behavior. At one point, during a particularly emotional moment in Margaret's testimony, as she described Emma researching the penalties for hit and run versus DUI manslaughter and concluding that running was the right call, cameras captured Emma briefly rolling her eyes before resuming her neutral expression. This reaction did not go unnoticed by Judge Chen, who was observed making a note on his legal pad, or by the jury, several of whom exchanged glances in apparent response to Emma's inappropriate behavior. Defense attorney Lawrence Bartlett's cross-examination of Margaret Johnson focused on portraying her as a mother who had failed her daughter in various ways, suggesting that she and Robert had enabled Emma's sense of entitlement through years of shielding her from consequences. Isn't it true that this wasn't the first time you and your husband intervened to protect Emma from legal consequences? Bartlett asked, referencing an incident the previous year when Emma had allegedly struck a parked car while driving without a license, and her parents had paid for the damages privately to avoid insurance or police involvement. Margaret reluctantly confirmed this incident, along with several others where parental intervention had shielded Emma from facing consequences for her actions, including an incident of plagiarism at school and suspected shoplifting that had been resolved through the family's connections and financial resources. The following day, Robert Johnson took the stand, his testimony largely corroborating his wife's account, while adding crucial details about his own role in the cover-up. Appearing haggard and significantly older than his 53 years, Robert described receiving a call from Margaret on the evening of September 19th, informing him that Emma had been in an accident. "When I got home from my business dinner around 11, Emma immediately took charge of the situation," he testified. "She was remarkably calm, listing the steps we needed to take to fix this problem," as she called it. Robert described how Emma had directed him to move the damaged Lexus into the garage, instructed him on which cleaning products to purchase the next morning, and researched repair shops that wouldn't ask too many questions. Robert's testimony included a particularly revealing account of a conversation with Emma the morning after the collision, after they had seen news reports about Gabrielle Torres's death. "I asked Emma directly if she had hit a person rather than a deer, and she admitted it, but in a way that was chilling," Robert testified, his voice breaking. "She said, 'Yes, I hit someone, but they're dead now, so it doesn't matter whether I stopped or not. What matters is making sure this doesn't ruin my life.'" This account of Emma's callous response to taking a human life caused visible reactions among the jurors and spectators, with Gabrielle's mother leaving the courtroom briefly, supported by a victim advocate. The prosecution's questioning of Robert Johnson culminated in his description of arranging for the vehicle to be repaired at Victor Mendoza's shop and his subsequent attempts to create alibis for Emma when investigators began asking questions. "I'm deeply ashamed of my actions," Robert stated, looking directly at the Torres family for the first time. "I failed not only as a parent, but as a human being by participating in this cover-up." When Phillips asked what had ultimately motivated him to accept the plea deal and testify against his daughter, Robert's response was unequivocal. The truth needed to come out. What happened to Gabrielle Torres was inexcusable, and the person responsible needs to face consequences, even if that person is my child. During cross-examination, defense attorney Bartlett attempted to suggest that Robert and Margaret were scapegoating their daughter to secure more lenient sentences for themselves, a line of questioning that led to one of the trial's most dramatic exchanges. "Isn't it true that you're testifying against your own daughter to save yourself from a lengthy prison sentence?" Bartlett asked, his tone accusatory. Robert Johnson leaned forward in the witness box, his expression suddenly fierce. "No, sir, that is not true," he responded firmly. "I'm testifying because for perhaps the first time in my daughter's life, I'm refusing to shield her from the consequences of her actions. My wife and I have accepted responsibility for our role in this tragedy. We're asking the court to ensure that Emma does the same." Expert testimony from Dr. Eleanor Ramirez, a forensic psychologist who had reviewed the evidence and conducted an evaluation of Emma Johnson, provided the jury with insights into the psychological aspects of the case. Dr. Ramirez testified about the distinctive patterns in Emma's behavior before, during, and after the fatal collision, identifying traits consistent with what she described as callous, unemotional features and narcissistic tendencies. While careful to avoid diagnosing Emma with any specific personality disorder, given her age, Dr. Ramirez explained that the evidence, including Emma's social media history, text messages, and behavior during interrogation, suggested a concerning pattern of manipulative behavior, limited empathy, and a profound self-focus that prioritized her own convenience and comfort over the value of human life. Dr. Ramirez's testimony included analysis of Emma's digital communications in the days following the collision, noting the complete absence of expressions of remorse or concern for Gabrielle Torres. What we see instead, Dr. Ramirez testified, are calculations about how to avoid consequences, assessments of which family members and friends could be trusted to maintain the cover-up, and preoccupation with how the situation might affect her college applications and social status. Particularly revealing, in Dr. Ramirez's assessment, were messages Emma had sent to a friend 3 days after the collision, in which she complained about having to miss a party because her parents were being paranoid about her going out, with no acknowledgement that her actions had resulted in a woman's death and 2 children losing their mother. The defense called several character witnesses, including Emma's school counselor and 2 teachers who described her as a bright, promising student with a record of academic achievement and community service. These testimonials, however, were significantly undermined during cross-examination when Phillips presented evidence that much of Emma's community service had been performed only after she had been caught cheating on exams, as part of a disciplinary arrangement that allowed her to avoid academic probation. Similarly, testimony from Emma's friends about her character was weakened by their admissions, under Phillips's questioning, that they had witnessed Emma driving after drinking on multiple occasions prior to the fatal collision, including an incident just 2 weeks earlier when she had narrowly avoided hitting a cyclist. The technical aspects of the case were further reinforced by testimony from technology expert Devin Williams, who presented a detailed analysis of Emma's phone usage on the evening of September 19th. Williams testified that Emma's phone records indicated she had been actively using the device at the exact time of the collision, sending a text message at 9:46 and 38 seconds, approximately 20 seconds before impact. This evidence directly supported the prosecution's narrative that Emma had been both intoxicated and distracted by her phone when she struck Gabriel Torres, explaining why she had failed to see the victim in the well-lit crosswalk or apply brakes before impact. Williams's testimony was accompanied by a technical reconstruction of Emma's digital activities throughout the evening, creating a comprehensive timeline that aligned perfectly with the traffic camera footage and witness accounts. The final and perhaps most emotionally powerful testimony came from Carmen Torres, Gabriel's sister, who had assumed guardianship of her niece and nephew after their mother's death. Carmen spoke about the devastating impact of Gabriel's loss on the family, particularly her children, Elena and Marco. Elena used to be at the top of her class, just like her mother was at that age, Carmen testified, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her face. Since losing her mom, she's struggled to concentrate. Her grades have dropped, and she has nightmares almost every night. Marco's regression had been even more pronounced, with the 8-year-old returning to bedwetting and developing selective mutism that required intensive therapy. These children didn't just lose their mother, Carmen told the jury. They lost their sense of security, their belief that the world is safe and fair. As the testimonial phase of the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense prepared for their closing arguments, with the weight of evidence clearly favoring the prosecution's narrative of a callous teen who had chosen to drive while intoxicated and distracted, fled the scene after killing Gabriel Torres, and then orchestrated an elaborate cover-up with no apparent remorse for her actions. Throughout the testimony, Emma Johnson had maintained the same composed, occasionally smirking demeanor that had characterized her courtroom presence from the beginning, a behavior pattern that had not gone unnoticed by the jury and that would factor significantly into their deliberations in the days to come. After 8 days of testimony, closing arguments began on March 1, 2017, with prosecutor Sophia Phillips addressing the jury one final time. Standing before them without notes, Phillips methodically summarized the evidence against Emma Johnson, weaving together the technical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and testimony about the cover-up into a compelling narrative of callous disregard for human life. "The evidence before you is overwhelming and unambiguous," Phillips stated, her voice resonating throughout the silent courtroom. Emma Johnson chose to drink underage, chose to drive while impaired, chose to text while driving at nearly 20 miles over the speed limit, chose to flee after striking Gabriel Torres rather than stopping to render aid, and chose to orchestrate an elaborate cover-up to escape accountability for taking a human life. Phillips then pointed directly at Emma, who sat impassively at the defense table, adding, "At each of these decision points, Emma Johnson demonstrated that she valued her own convenience more than Gabriel Torres's life." Defense attorney Lawrence Bartlett's closing argument focused on Emma's youth, arguing that her actions, while serious, should be viewed through the lens of adolescent brain development rather than adult standards of behavior. Science tells us that the teenage brain is not fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control, risk assessment, and long-term planning, Bartlett told the jury, displaying brain scan images on a large screen. When Emma made the tragic decision to leave the scene, she was not thinking with the mature judgment of an adult, but reacting with the impulsivity and panic of a 16-year-old girl. Bartlett also attempted to shift some responsibility to Robert and Margaret Johnson, suggesting they had created a family environment where problems were expected to be hidden rather than addressed honestly, and emphasizing their admission that they had helped conceal evidence before ultimately turning against their daughter to secure more lenient treatment for themselves. In her powerful rebuttal, Phillips directly challenged Bartlett's characterization of Emma as a frightened teenager who had panicked after a tragic accident. "The evidence before you shows not panic but calculation, not fear but cold self-interest," Phillips argued, displaying Emma's text messages sent after the collision. "These are not the words of someone overwhelmed by a situation beyond their understanding. They are the words of someone weighing options, creating alibis, and making strategic decisions to protect themselves at all costs." Phillips concluded by reminding the jury of their duty to deliver justice for Gabriel Torres, whose voice had been silenced forever, and for her children, who would grow up without their mother because of Emma Johnson's actions and subsequent attempts to escape responsibility. Judge Raymond Chen delivered his instructions to the jury late that afternoon, carefully explaining the legal standards for each charge and the requirement that they find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. "You must set aside any personal feelings about the defendant or the victim and base your verdict solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom," Judge Chen instructed, his tone solemn. "You must also remember that in our justice system, youth is not an excuse for criminal behavior, though it may be considered during sentencing if a guilty verdict is reached." With these final instructions, the jury was sequestered to begin their deliberations, leaving Emma Johnson to wait alongside her defense team in a private conference room adjacent to the courtroom. The jury's deliberations lasted just 4 hours and 23 minutes, a surprisingly brief period given the complexity of the case and the serious nature of the charges. When the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached, the courtroom quickly filled with spectators, including members of the Torres family, Emma's relatives, and journalists who had been covering the trial since its beginning. Emma entered the courtroom flanked by her defense team, her expression controlled, but with a visible tension around her eyes that hadn't been present during the trial. Judge Chen called the court to order, and the jury filed in, their faces solemn and several appearing emotionally affected by the weight of their decision. As the court clerk read the verdict, the room remained perfectly still. On the count of vehicular manslaughter, we find the defendant, Emma Johnson, guilty. A soft cry came from the gallery where Gabriel's mother sat, but Emma showed no reaction as the clerk continued. On the count of driving under the influence, guilty. On the count of leaving the scene of a fatal accident, guilty. On the count of tampering with evidence, guilty. On each count, Emma's expression remained unchanged, her posture rigid, as she stared straight ahead. Only when Judge Chen asked if the defense wished to have the jury polled did a flicker of emotion cross her face, a momentary tightening of her jaw as each juror individually confirmed their vote of guilty on all charges. The Torres family's reaction to the verdict was one of quiet relief rather than celebration, with Gabriel's parents embracing each other silently as tears streamed down their faces. Gabriel's sister Carmen sat with an arm around each of her niece and nephew, whispering to them as the verdict was read, later telling reporters that she had promised the children that the person who took your mommy away is going to face consequences for what she did. The family's dignity throughout the trial had earned them the respect of the community, with their attorney reading a brief statement after the verdict that thanked the prosecutors and investigators while expressing hope that no family will ever again have to experience the double trauma of losing a loved one to a hit-and-run driver, and then watching the perpetrator show no remorse throughout the legal process. Judge Chen scheduled the sentencing hearing for March 15th, allowing 2 weeks for the completion of a pre-sentencing investigation and victim impact statements. During this period, Emma remained in custody, having been denied bail following the guilty verdict. Reports from detention center staff during this time noted a significant shift in Emma's behavior. The composed, occasionally smirking demeanor she had maintained throughout the trial was replaced by unpredictable mood swings, including episodes of rage directed at staff and other detainees. One incident report documented Emma telling a guard that my parents will pay for what they did to me, referring to their testimony against her and expressing confidence that her father's connections would still find a way to fix this before sentencing. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements from Gabriel Torres's family, including a particularly moving statement from her father, Javier Torres. Speaking through an interpreter, he described the devastation of losing his daughter and the ongoing struggles of his grandchildren to cope with their mother's death. Elena asks me every night why the girl who killed her mother is always smirking in the courtroom pictures in the newspaper, Javier stated, his voice breaking with emotion. I have no answer that makes sense to her or to myself. Gabriel's children had prepared drawings that were submitted to the court, with 10-year-old Elena's depicting her mother as an angel watching over a school classroom and 8-year-old Marco's showing simply a family with a mother figure erased, and a large question mark beside it, a poignant representation of his struggle to understand his loss. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Emma Johnson's statement revealed the same lack of empathy and self-focus that had characterized her behavior throughout the case. Rather than expressing remorse for taking Gabriel's life, Emma focused primarily on how the case had affected her own future prospects. I know a mistake was made, she stated, using passive language that avoided direct acknowledgement of responsibility, and I regret that Ms. Torres lost her life in this accident. Emma then proceeded to list her previous academic achievements and community involvement, suggesting that she could still contribute to society in meaningful ways if given a lenient sentence. Perhaps most disturbing was her assertion that this experience has taught me important lessons about responsibility, a statement that rang hollow given the overwhelming evidence of her efforts to escape responsibility at every stage of the case. Judge Chen's sentencing statement made it clear that he had been deeply troubled by Emma's behavior throughout the legal proceedings and her continued failure to demonstrate genuine remorse. Ms. Johnson, I have presided over many vehicular homicide cases in my career, and while all involved tragedy, few have disturbed me as profoundly as yours, Judge Chen stated, looking directly at Emma. What the evidence in this case reveals is not simply a terrible mistake made by a young person, but a pattern of calculated self-interest and disregard for human life that continued long after the fatal collision. Judge Chen specifically referenced Emma's courtroom demeanor, noting that throughout the trial she had demonstrated more concern for her appearance and social standing than for the life she took and the family she shattered. The sentence, when delivered, was more severe than many legal observers had anticipated given Emma's age, 70 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after serving 35 years. This sentence reflects not only the taking of Gabrielle Torres's life, but the extraordinary efforts to escape accountability afterward and the complete absence of genuine remorse throughout these proceedings, Judge Chen explained. It also considers the need to protect society from someone who has demonstrated such profound disregard for the value of human life. The judge further ordered that Emma pay restitution to the Torres family, including funding for Elena and Marco's educational and psychological care needs through adulthood, and that she complete extensive substance abuse and psychological treatment programs during her incarceration. Emma's reaction to the sentence provided the trial's final dramatic moment, as the composure she had maintained throughout the proceedings finally shattered completely. As Judge Chen concluded the sentencing, Emma turned toward her parents in the gallery and erupted in rage, screaming, "This is your fault! You were supposed to protect me!" Court deputies moved quickly to restrain her as she continued shouting accusations at her parents, calling them traitors and liars who had thrown their own daughter under the bus to save themselves. The outburst continued as Emma was led from the courtroom, her voice echoing through the hallway with promises that you'll all be sorry, and demands that her father fix this like you fix everything else. The media coverage of Emma's courtroom outburst dominated local news that evening, with the Arizona Republic's headline reading, "Teen Killer's Mask Finally Slips. Johnson Erupts at Parents After 70-Year Sentence." Video of the incident went viral nationally, appearing on major news networks and generating extensive discussion on social media about juvenile justice, parental responsibility, and the psychology of remorseless offenders. Legal analysts noted that Emma's behavior at sentencing likely confirmed for many observers, including the judge, that the prosecution's characterization of her as calculating, manipulative, and lacking in empathy had been accurate, with one commentator observing that in those unguarded moments of rage, we saw the real Emma Johnson, not concerned about Gabrielle Torres or her children, but furious that her parents had failed to maintain the web of lies that might have allowed her to escape consequences. The Torres family's response to the sentence and Emma's outburst was characterized by the same dignity they had shown throughout the proceedings. In a brief statement to the press, Carmen Torres expressed that, while no sentence can bring Gabrielle back or fill the void in her children's lives, today's decision affirms that our justice system recognizes the value of my sister's life and the gravity of taking it so carelessly. She added that the family would now focus on healing and on providing Elena and Marco with the loving support they need to move forward despite this terrible loss. The family's attorney announced the establishment of the Gabrielle Torres Memorial Scholarship for aspiring teachers from underserved communities, ensuring that Gabrielle's passion for education would continue to benefit others despite her untimely death. The 70-year sentence handed down to Emma Johnson on March 15, 2017, represented one of the harshest penalties ever imposed on a juvenile offender in Arizona's history, sparking intense debate among legal experts, child advocates, and the general public. While some argued that the sentence appropriately reflected the severity of Emma's actions and her subsequent lack of remorse, others expressed concern that it effectively eliminated any meaningful chance at rehabilitation for someone who had committed her crime at 16. This sentence essentially says that Emma Johnson at 16 is beyond redemption, noted juvenile justice advocate Dr. Alicia Washington in a widely circulated opinion piece. While her actions were undeniably heinous and her behavior during trial deeply troubling, we must ask whether our justice system should ever completely abandon the possibility of rehabilitation for a juvenile offender, no matter how serious the crime. The Johnson family faced their own legal and social consequences in the aftermath of the trial, with both Robert and Margaret Johnson receiving 3-year sentences for their roles in concealing evidence, though they were permitted to serve these terms consecutively so that one parent could remain available to manage family affairs while the other was incarcerated. Beyond their legal penalties, the Johnsons experienced profound social and professional fallout, with Robert losing his position at a prestigious investment firm, and the family forced to sell their Paradise Valley home to pay legal expenses and the restitution ordered by the court. Once fixtures of Phoenix's social elite, the Johnsons became pariahs, with former friends and associates distancing themselves from what one local columnist described as a family whose wealth and privilege had created a monster and who had prioritized protecting that monster over justice for an innocent victim. Emma began serving her sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, initially housed in a special unit for juvenile offenders convicted as adults, before being transferred to the general population when she turned 18 in November 2018. Reports from corrections officials indicated that Emma's adjustment to prison life was difficult, marked by conflicts with other inmates and staff, disciplinary infractions for disrespectful and manipulative behavior, and ongoing denial of responsibility for Gabriel Torres's death. During her first year of incarceration, Emma filed multiple appeals challenging both her conviction and sentence, all of which were denied by higher courts that found no procedural errors in her trial and deemed the sentence appropriate given the egregious nature of her crimes and post-offense conduct. Perhaps the most revealing insight into Emma's mindset came from a prison counselor's report filed 18 months into her sentence, which noted that during group therapy sessions, Emma consistently framed herself as the victim in the case, expressing anger at her parents for betraying her, but showing no genuine remorse for taking Gabriel's life. Subject continues to externalize responsibility, suggesting that society's expectations of sobriety for teenage drivers are unrealistic and that accidents happen all the time, the counselor wrote. When reminded that her actions after the collision, fleeing the scene and orchestrating a cover-up, indicated consciousness of guilt rather than panic, Subject became hostile and terminated the session. This pattern of deflection and self-focus persisted throughout her early years of incarceration, with multiple therapists documenting Emma's resistance to accepting responsibility for her actions. For the Torres family, the years following Gabriel's death and Emma's conviction brought both ongoing grief and gradual healing, particularly for Gabriel's children, Elena and Marco. With the dedicated support of their Aunt Carmen and grandparents, both children received intensive therapy to help them process their trauma and loss. 3 years after their mother's death, Carmen reported cautious optimism about their progress, noting that Elena had begun to regain her academic focus and that Marco was speaking more freely, though both children continued to experience profound moments of grief, particularly around birthdays, holidays, and the anniversary of their mother's death. They're resilient in ways no child should have to be, Carmen told a local reporter during an interview marking the 3rd anniversary of Gabriel's death. They're carrying her love with them and finding ways to honor her memory that help them move forward without forgetting. The Gabriel Torres Memorial Scholarship, established by her family and former colleagues at Sunnyside Elementary, provided its first awards in May 2018 to 3 aspiring teachers from low-income backgrounds who demonstrated Gabriel's commitment to serving underprivileged communities. By 2020, the scholarship fund had grown significantly through community donations and corporate partnerships, allowing it to support 5 students annually with full tuition and textbook stipends at Arizona State University's College of Education. Recipients of the scholarship, known as Torres Scholars, committed to teaching for at least 3 years in underserved school districts after graduation. ensuring that Gabrielle's dedication to educational equity would continue to benefit children in need long after her death. The intersection where Gabrielle was killed underwent significant safety improvements in the years following the tragedy, with the city of Phoenix installing enhanced lighting, pedestrian-activated crossing signals, and traffic calming measures designed to reduce vehicle speeds. A small memorial plaque bearing Gabrielle's name and the inscription, "Beloved Teacher, Mother, Daughter, Forever in Our Hearts," was placed near the crosswalk, becoming a site where her students and colleagues would occasionally leave flowers or notes, particularly around the anniversary of her death. The intersection improvements became part of a broader pedestrian safety initiative across Phoenix, with city planners citing the Torres case as a catalyst for renewed attention to creating safer street designs that prioritized pedestrian protection in a city historically dominated by automobile traffic. The case left a lasting impact on the Phoenix legal community, with prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges referring to the Emma Johnson case as a benchmark for discussions about juvenile justice, appropriate sentencing for vehicular homicide, and the challenges of addressing narcissistic traits in youthful offenders. Prosecutor Sophia Phillips, whose careful building of the case had been widely praised, became a sought-after speaker at legal conferences where she emphasized the importance of digital evidence in modern prosecutions and the need for sensitive handling of cases involving juvenile offenders showing concerning psychological traits. "The goal isn't punishment for its own sake," Phillips noted during one such presentation, but rather ensuring accountability while recognizing that young offenders, even those who have committed terrible acts, remain capable of change if they can develop genuine insight and remorse. Detective Nathaniel Reed, whose thorough investigation had been crucial to securing Emma's conviction, later cited the case as both the most challenging and most important of his career. "What stays with me isn't just the technical aspects of the investigation, but the stark contrast between Gabrielle Torres and Emma Johnson, one living a life of service and sacrifice, the other of self-absorption and entitlement," Reed reflected during an interview for a documentary about the case produced by a local university's film program. "I've investigated hundreds of crimes in my career, but few have illustrated so clearly how character shapes the choices we make in critical moments and how those choices can devastate so many lives." Reed subsequently developed a training program for law enforcement focused on the effective investigation of fatal traffic incidents, emphasizing the importance of digital evidence and early identification of cover-up attempts. 5 years after Gabrielle's death, the Phoenix School District dedicated the new Sunnyside Elementary Library in her honor, creating a vibrant space filled with books, technology resources, and comfortable reading areas designed to foster the love of learning that had characterized Gabrielle's teaching approach. A portrait of Gabrielle, painted by a local artist, hung in the library entrance, alongside a plaque bearing her often repeated phrase, "Education is freedom," and a brief biography highlighting her contributions to the school community. The dedication ceremony brought together former students, colleagues, and family members, including Elena and Marco, now teenagers themselves, who participated in cutting the ribbon to officially open the space. Marco, who had been nearly silent in the immediate aftermath of his mother's death, read a poem he had written for the occasion, his quiet voice gaining strength as he shared memories of his mother reading to him and his sister each night before bed. While the Torres family gradually found ways to honor Gabrielle's memory and move forward with their lives, the Johnson family remained fractured by the consequences of Emma's actions and their own complicity in the attempted cover-up. Robert and Margaret Johnson divorced during their consecutive prison terms, their relationship ultimately unable to withstand the strain of their shared guilt and the public shame that had transformed their once privileged lives. After completing his sentence, Robert relocated to another state, changing his name and seeking anonymity as he attempted to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. Margaret remained in Arizona after her release, living quietly in a modest apartment and working at a small accounting firm, occasionally visiting Emma in prison, though these visits were reportedly tense and emotionally fraught. With Emma continuing to blame her parents for her incarceration, rather than accepting responsibility for the actions that had placed her there. The most profound legacy of the case, beyond its impact on the families directly involved, was perhaps its influence on public discourse about privilege, accountability, and the criminal justice system. The stark contrasts of the case between the Torres and Johnson families, between Emma's calculating self-interest and Gabriel's selfless dedication, between the initial attempt to use wealth and connections to escape consequences and the ultimate delivery of justice, resonated deeply in a community increasingly concerned about inequities in how the legal system treated offenders of different socioeconomic backgrounds. Local school districts incorporated the case into educational programs about responsible decision-making, substance abuse prevention, and the serious legal and moral consequences of driving under the influence, with students reportedly particularly affected by hearing Marco and Elena's perspectives on growing up without their mother. 10 years after the fatal collision that took Gabriel Torres's life, Emma Johnson remains incarcerated at the Arizona State Prison Complex, her appeals exhausted and her earliest possible parole date still decades in the future. Prison records indicate gradual changes in her behavior and perspective, with recent psychological evaluations noting some development of empathy and the beginnings of genuine remorse, though whether these changes reflect authentic psychological growth or calculated attempts to improve her prospects for eventual parole remains a subject of debate among those familiar with the case. What remains undisputed is the enduring impact of her actions on that September evening in 2016, actions that, in a matter of seconds, took the life of a beloved teacher and mother and set in motion consequences that would permanently alter the trajectories of two families and leave an indelible mark on the Phoenix community's collective memory.